Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Whenever it is you're watching, you're very welcome and thank you very much for joining us. Today we're going to be looking at a line from the very well-known 23rd Psalm, which begins, "The Lord is my shepherd." If you have the time, please can you now stop this video and read that psalm to yourselves. It's Psalm 23. Psalm 23. Well, thank you for doing that. And I want to explore one line with us. And that line is, "Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me." And that seems to me a very appropriate verse to consider together because of the word, the phrase, the image, the valley of the shadow of death. Because we are living in shadowy times. We all feel overwhelmed and daunted by the shadow that coronavirus is throwing across our land and indeed across our world. It's a very sad time. And shadows play a very important part in our lives, don't they? Perhaps you remember as a child when you were going for a walk with your parents, the sun was shining, and you started to jump on your parents, your father, your mother's shadow. It was great fun. Maybe also you remember how you used to form animal shapes with your hands through a shadow being cast on the wall. Shadows can be fun, but often they're very, very frightening. I remember as a child growing up in the countryside and being quite terrified having to go out, perhaps on my own, across a dark patch and the shadows being cast by the moonlight. Was it a lion that the bush was casting as a shadow? Was it a giant that the tree stump was casting across my path? Whatever the shape was, it could be frightening and terrifying. And that's one of the powers of shadows, that they're more powerful often than the reality that lies behind them. And so it is that we are coping with many shadows. People have been coping with the shadow that they might not have enough food. Others are coping with the shadow that they're going to lose their freedoms or their companions because they can't go to work. Others are coping with the shadow of loneliness as they're confined to their house and cut off from their loved ones. Others are just coping with the shadow of coping. How are we going to cope with our children and the schooling and the work we have to do from home all at the same time? There is the shadow of general anxiety, which makes life very difficult. And at the end of the road, there is, of course, the shadow of death itself. And all of these shadows generate anxiety and fear among us. It's understandable. And so it's important we remember that the shadows can be far worse than the reality. The psalmist said, "Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you, his God, are with me." And that's what we need to remember all the time, that we are not alone. Walking through a valley is not a quick sprint. And it looks as though we're going to have many, many weeks of walking through the valley that the coronavirus has created in our communities. How are we going to cope? Are we going to panic buy because we are anxious about food and the shadow that casts? Are we going to do wild things because we're afraid of losing our freedoms? Are we going to break down because we feel we can't cope with all the pressures? All of these things are happening, and we have to understand that they can happen to us. But as Christian people, we need to be able to offer something more. So as we walk with fellow believers, with our families, with our neighbours, through this long valley that casts its dreadful shadow across us, I believe God is calling us to show his presence is with us. And in the second video, I'm going to be exploring a different picture of two who were struggling with the valley of the shadow of death. So please, thank you for being here now, and go over to the next video and find out what God has to say to us. Thank you so much.